Chapter 2 Wilderness Friendship. The black wolf sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley of the Little Sheep Creek. Except for his great size, he resembled a dog, a wise dog, in whose eyes gleamed intelligence and confidence. The sun was vanishing behind the peaks on the horizon, and the shadows were deep in the canyons and valleys, but the wolf could still see almost as clearly as in the middle of the day. He was watching the animals that felt sufficiently safe now to move out from their hiding places in order to find food. His cocked ears caught many sounds made by the stirring of these creatures among the loose stones, dead leaves, and brittle twigs. There were 3 caribou only 100 yards away, traveling single file along a game trail that ran parallel to the ridge. One was an old cow, with a small calf close at heel, and the third a young bull, with little antlers beginning to show. This yearling bull was following the other 2 at a short distance, hesitatingly, as if apologetic for his presence, but lacking the insurance to wander alone. The cow caribou stopped to let the gray-faced marmot scurry across the path, to gain the safety of his burrow among the higher rocks before darkness brought out any more of his enemies. In daylight, he could hope to dodge the eagles, but he, like his small cousins, the squirrels, was one of the few animals that did not trust his eyesight at night, when the great horned owls were flying, and the bears, lynx, coyotes, timber wolves, foxes, and wolverines did most of their hunting. The old wolf watched everything. He saw the 2 bull moose go trotting down the valley, and then suddenly stop and stampede. This warned him that man was near, for nothing else was likely to have quite that effect on the big creatures. Leaving his lookout rock to investigate, he loped noiselessly into the forest and made a half circle which crossed Johnny's trail some distance below the scene of the stampede. The fresh footprints of the horses and the scent hanging in the air told him at once that the man was his regular neighbor who lived on the divide, and the horses, those that he was accustomed to see and hear. Cautiously he walked along the trail, studying the footprints and looking for anything unusual. Where the horses had turned back, he caught the scent of the hound pups, and he stopped in his tracks. He knew all about dogs, and the help they gave man in trailing him and his kind. Like a shadow, he melted into the woods and loped down the mountain. Nothing followed him, however, and reassured, he finally stopped and sat on another big rock to puzzle over the situation. A half-hour passed, and night blotted all but the outline of the trees. Very slowly he began to retrace his footsteps. He wanted to find out what had become of the dogs, and make sure they did not mean some new kind of danger. Where he first caught the dog scent, he stood for some time listening, and then he began another circle, which brought him eventually to a point where the night air blowing from the lost pups carried their scent faintly to his nostrils. He heard Johnny come stumbling down the trail on his search, and faintly he saw the moving reflections of the flashlight among the trees. When Johnny returned to his cabin, the wolf was still standing in his strategic spot, his attention always held by the scent of the dog, which persisted. At length he felt safe in going a few paces nearer, and then a few more paces. His nose told him the exact spot from whence the scent came. Peculiar scent that it was, different from that of any dog he'd ever known. And more suspiciously than before, he stalked it, a few steps at a time, always watching for a trap of some kind, his every sense alert. Coming at length to the edge of the path, he crept along it, hidden in the deep shadows, expecting to find a big dog, or perhaps several, like those he'd always seen. He gave the queer little bump in the trail ahead scarcely more than a passing glance, but his nose told him more accurately than his eyes that what he sought was very near, and when that little bump suddenly moved, his tenseness was so great that he leapt to one side. Toward him, with timid, faltering steps, came the lost pup, which had been so shaken when he fell from the horse's back that he'd been wandering around in the woods almost blindly. At length, finding the path, he'd forlornly sat down in the middle of it, too frightened to whimper or howl. And now he saw the wolf, a dog-like creature which might help him. And so his hopes rose, and he went forward to make friends. The wolf retreated, and Reddy followed. The wolf then backed away more slowly, still completely bewildered by finding such a little pup. Suddenly he sprang at the hound and seized it in his great teeth, all his hate for dogs that had persecuted him showing in his snarl. But he did not clamp down tightly. A strange feeling held him from killing this miserable little enemy. He let it go and towered over it as it groveled meekly in the dirt. Each time it got together enough courage to crawl between his feet, he seized it again, fiercely and with terrible growls, but always without hurting it. Finally he sprang away and loped into the shadows. He stopped after a few bounds and looked behind him, and sure enough the little pup was following. Again he bounded away and stopped, and still the little dog waddled trustfully after him. The same thing happened a number of times. Finally, the big wolf turned up the ridge and galloped all the way to the top, where he could look for miles in several directions and see friend as well as foe. But he often looked back, for he was expecting to see the little pup clumsily following him as before. When the dog did not appear, he became nervous and walked about. It was then that something impelled him to howl. With his head held high and his nose pointed well up in the air, he gave the lonely wolf call which Johnny heard, but which few, if any creatures except those of the wolf tribe, could locate, as its tones rose and fell and the echoes resounded from the rocks in every direction. After that he worried less about the pup and went trotting down the other side of the ridge in search of food. And to him food meant fresh meat. He passed a porcupine which raised his quills and ambled to the nearest tree. But he was in search of something better, and scarcely gave the timid creature a second glance. A few yards further he scented a fox, and picked up the trail of this furtive animal, which he knew would be smart enough to keep out of his way. The distance between the fox's footprints told him very plainly that the bushy-tailed one was running in great leaps, as if chasing some other creature. And at that moment a large snowshoe hare dashed past in the other direction as it doubled back on its trail to evade the pursuer. The wolf shot forward like lightning and had the hare caught before it could go many yards. He stood over the carcass for a short time waiting to see whether the fox or any animal would dare come to dispute his right to kill. And then with his forefeet holding it down, he tore and carved it into edible pieces, each one without much or any of the unpalatable fur. The last piece he did not swallow. Laying it down in front of him, he looked up at the ridge and waited for several minutes. Presently he lifted it carefully in his jaws and trotted in the direction from which he'd come, over the ridge and down the other side to the place where he'd last seen the pup. The little hound was sitting there, lost and disconsolate. He'd wandered about, but always coming back to the same place. And now, at the approach of the wolf, he stood up and violently wagged his tail in recognition. The big animal walked around him rather stiffly, and finally dropped the meat a few feet away. It was awkwardly done, but nevertheless it was a remarkable gesture of friendliness, and an acknowledgment that the wolf felt ties of kinship and the rights of a helpless young one to his bounty and support. If the pup had not acted his proper part, the whole affair might have been ended right then and there. But after one whiff, with his puckered little nose, he fairly pounced on the fresh meat and gnawed at it with saliva dripping from his jowls. The king watched, his tongue lolling out, and his sensitive ears for once at ease. Forgotten experiences influenced him now more than he understood. Once he'd accepted a wolfish dog into his pack when he roamed the valley of the Porcupine, a faithful creature that stuck to him all through the dangers of his terrific life as a leader. And then he'd become accustomed to the dog scent before he learned to associate dogs with men. As the pup licked his lips after his meal and came confidently toward his benefactor, fairly wriggling with appreciation and sudden love, The instinct to tolerate and take care of the young of his tribe surged over the great rough creature, and firmly fixed the binding tie of the earlier impulse. An odder combination or stranger friendship than that of the old black wolf and the little red hound could scarcely be imagined. Yet from that moment it never wavered. The wolf led and the little hound followed. Men and kennels passed out of the picture. Now it was the hard mountain wilderness that faced the pup, and he accepted it without the slightest hesitation, because he'd found one who could guide him, one whom he regarded with all the unquestioning trust and adulation of the very young accord to the heroes of their making. And so the old wolf led the way, tempering his pace to suit that of a little one who struggled to keep up with him. Up and up they went, into the realm of bare rocks and caves, where the grizzlies holed up in the autumn for their winter sleep, and where, between two boulders, the king knew of a very special den, just the right size at the entrance to fit a wolf, and deep enough among the rocks to be safe as a den could be. On the earth inside the two lay down, well apart from each other, for there was still a shyness between them. The pup sprawled out and went to sleep from sheer exhaustion, and the wolf, after sniffing around the little fellow in the dark and satisfying himself that all was well, quietly slipped outside and sat for a time on a rock near the entrance, loath to leave, and yet drawn by the irresistible impulse to finish his night's hunting. The yapping of a coyote caught his attention, and the hair along his spine bristled as he listened. And for the first time in years, he sent back the challenging roar of the male wolf with a family to guard, one who would brook no trespassing in his chosen territory. End of chapter 2.